Comparative. Say that I got it. Comparative and International Connections to Lewis. I'm Ralph Goldstein, current president of the Lewis Society, expressing gratitude to Director Sally Perry and our tech wizard Edsel Cintron Gonzalez, and all the presenters who have come before us. Our panel's first presenter is Sean Nye, Associate Professor of Practice in Musicology at the University of Southern California. His research crosses 20th century popular music, literature and exile studies, science fiction, and media studies. In 2013, he received his PhD in the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. His paper, It Can Happen Here, The Transatlantic Exchanges of Sinclair Lewis, Dorothy Thompson, and Leon Feuchtwanger.
Feuchtwanger.
One more time, Fred.
Feuchtwanger.
Feuchtwanger.
Yeah, Feuchtwanger.
All right, thank you.
We'll get the secret to the name in a bit.
Traces Lewis's 1935 novel as a multi-layered transatlantic text informed not only by Lewis's American critique, but also by his European travels and connections. Along with the central role of Dorothy Thompson, an additional author proved crucial here. Best-selling German Jewish novelist Leon Feuchtwanger.
Feuchtwanger, yeah. We'll look at it.
As seen through him, It Can't Happen Here can be read not just as a political warning, but as a complex novel informed by Lewis's travels and by German exile literature. Such a perspective challenges the basic perception of Lewis as an author defined by the Midwest. In September, Sean will be presenting at a two-day conference sponsored by USC, hoping to increase appreciation for Lewis in Feuchtwanger scholarship circles and the German exile community that settled in Los Angeles County that included Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht. Take it away, Sean.
Thank you. And thanks so much as a concluding panel as well to for the organizers of the conference, and been in correspondence with Sally and Ralph about this project, and special thanks also to Fred Betts, who's on the in the virtual Zoom community here. And I'll start off quickly with the time that we have, just to explain how I got to doing a scholarship about Mr. Feuchtwanger. So let's get into this with the slides. So as Ralph mentioned, I went to university in graduate school in Minnesota and spent 6 years there, had know the state well, made it to Sauk Center once briefly, but surprisingly did not become a Lewis scholar until I moved to Los Angeles. And I have Leon Feuchtwanger actually to thank for that. And just to explain, in the context of German studies, exile studies is a field primarily focused on German authors, filmmakers, musicians who fled Germany in the 1930s and 40s, settling in the US and other countries around the world, and their practices, and Los Angeles was a major site for that. When moving and starting to work at USC, I had music as a primary interest, but German and English as my main languages. And one of the research that I've conducted since moving here has been at the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library, which is a key site in the archives here at the University of Southern California. And so this is a picture also of what's called the Villa Aurora. This is the main home of Feuchtwanger, quite a lavish home in Pacific Palisades on above Santa Monica. And that has become an artist's residence since 1995, inviting primarily European artists moving to LA, and is also sponsored by the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. So there's a lot of interaction back and forth between the archive and the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library. Feuchtwanger's widow dedicated it to the university. So this was set up in 1995. My favorite room and center in the library this is the actual room of the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library, which is also opened in 1995 as a center for German exile studies in Los Angeles. The last few years, it's been very interesting for the community to the extent, and also scholarship, to the extent that Villa Aurora was on its own for quite some time until in 2016, the Thomas Mann house where Thomas Mann lived was bought by the German federal government and is now a center for exile exchange or transatlantic exchange. Talked a lot about transatlanticism already, and we'll get into that more. It was listed in a very Babbitt fashion on the real estate market without any information that it was once Thomas Mann's house or the architectural significance. Mainly it stated the building's old, you could remodel it or demolish it, but the land is worth a lot. So if you want to get that, and the scholars and so the scholars and the German government heard about this, fortunately, and the house was bought and is now a center for transatlantic exchange. Was purchased in 2016 and just opened in 2018. So this is now a Thomas Mann Center. That was the foreign minister, now President Frank-Walter Steinmeier of Germany, given the opening of the house. So a lot has happened the last few years. I should say also the years of opening a center focused on democracy and transatlantic exchange. The years of 2016 and 2018 are not coincidental in some of these developments. And now, if you are interested in some of those links, there is now the Villa Aurora Thomas Mann House website, VATMH, which has different activities, cultural activities for these links. And it's just, fascinating development. Just thinking about authors' homes, as well as we've been doing this as, and to two authors who have important links to Sinclair Lewis as well. My talk is in that spirit. And so with that, I'll begin the presentation. When Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here was rediscovered during the 2016 election, many new American readers were stunned by the novel's insights. Published commentary from CNN to NPR to the New York Times often circle around a basic question. How could a 1935 novel by a long-neglected author be so perceptive about American politics and populism in particular? The haunting familiarity of Buzz Winthrop as a version of Donald Trump was often discussed, with many articles quoting the following description of Winthrop, quote, "The senator was vulgar, almost illiterate, a public liar easily detected, and in his ideas, almost idiotic, while his celebrated piety was that of a traveling salesman for church furniture, and his yet more celebrated humor, the sly cynicism of a country store." While these articles showed appreciation for such satire and Lewis's narrative as an American political warning, the international complexities that produced the novel were not fully understood at this time. This paper will trace It Can't Happen Here as a multi-layered transatlantic text, informed not only by American political critique, but also by Lewis's European travels and connections. More specifically, I believe the novel can be read not just as a political warning to America, but as an American novel distinctly informed by German exile literature. Such a perspective challenges the basic perception of Lewis as an author defined by the Midwest. Even though Lewis always highlighted his middlebrow Americanness while in Europe, his cheeky gestures were on display even at the height of his fame, such as when he departed to receive the Nobel Prize, posing with a practical book worthy of Babbitt, Swedish in 10 lessons. Still, a decade of expatriate life and travels in the 1920s left its mark with repeated year-long stays in Europe, especially in England and Italy. Lewis's Anglophile and Italophile tendencies gradually allowed for a greater prominence of Germany, especially Berlin, by the late 1920s. Dorothy Thompson's pivotal role is well known, as traced by Frederick Betz, Jörg Tunica, and Carino von Tippelskirch, among others. While adding to this research, I will highlight an additional writer who proves distinctly important for Lewis, leading to It Can't Happen Here, the best-selling German Jewish novelist, Leon Feuchtwanger. Through Feuchtwanger, Lewis's links to German exile literature can be highlighted, which include Thomas Mann, as well as daughter and son Erika and Klaus, Arnold Zweig, and others. In these connections, forged in Weimar Germany pre-exile, my sense is that Feuchtwanger was most important for the insights that would result in It Can't Happen Here. Oh, sorry, there might be someone not muted. The years 1927 and 28 proved central to these developments. Lewis traveled to Berlin for the second time. In contrast to a brief stay in 1925, 1927 suddenly resulted in a 6-month-long stay and in an even more extended European tour. Someone named Dorothy Thompson caused a change in plans. Lewis would meet Thompson and fall in love within 2 days of arriving. While primarily an Anglophile and Italophile, Lewis was drawn to Germany through the market success of his books and his own interest in German migration to the Midwest. Still, Lewis wouldn't have stayed in Berlin so long had he not met Thompson. The stay lasted from July 1927 to February 1928, with intermittent travels to Austria, England, and Russia. By September, Lewis had settled at the Hercules House near the Tiergarten postcard there. And here he would write The Man Who Knew Coolidge and start Dodsworth, his definitive expatriate novel. Dodsworth would be dedicated to Thompson and include extensive scenes in Berlin. Note here that in William Wyler's otherwise wonderful film adaptation in 1936, the scenes in Berlin are conspicuously absent. In Germany, in the late 1920s, though, personal, artistic, and business interests caught up with Lewis. While Weimar Berlin's expatriates have long been associated with Christopher Isherwood, who settled there in November 1929, Lewis and Thompson arguably became the city's most famous American expats pre-Great Depression. Their return to Berlin was then celebrated in December 1930, following Lewis's award of the Nobel Prize. And here are just 2 famous photos of that Berlin moment. It's fascinating to look at. So here is Lewis at the balcony of a very famous Hotel Adlon in Berlin, December 1930. And Thompson and Lewis together in Berlin, same photo series following the Nobel Prize. And, and you can see the Brandenburg Gate in the background with both of them. Lewis's connections to Weimar literary culture were indeed at their peak between 1927 and 1930. It was here that his exchange with Leon Feuchtwanger began. Feuchtwanger was a Bavarian Jewish author and leftist playwright closely connected to Munich's literary circles, including Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann. He gradually shifted from playwright to popular historical novelist, however, with the literary sensation of his 1925 novel, Jew Seuss, which dealt with the life of Joseph Seuss Oppenheimer, an 18th century businessman and political advisor at the court of Württemberg. The novel proved a bestseller in Germany, Britain, and America. It was translated into English by the famous couple, Willa and Edwin Muir, the original translators of Franz Kafka. Here you can see their names prominently shown in the English edition and the 16th edition, an indication of its bestseller status. In the same year as Aerosmith, Feuchtwanger thus achieved his own celebrated bestseller and moved from Munich to Berlin with his wife, Marta.
Yeah, that's a famous picture too.
That one too, yeah, from the 30s. I think that's them in France actually, but it's kind of from the era. He was thus in Berlin to hear about Lewis's extended visit, though it appears they did not manage a personal get-together at this time. Still, Feuchtwanger was eager to meet Lewis. As a historical novelist, he was devoted to Lewis's writings, especially Babbitt, published in German translation in 1924. His encounter with Babbitt was like a lightning strike. And he states that Lewis saw, quote, his own period in historical perspective, with Babbitt having the status as a kind of unequivocal historical figure. In this sense, Feuchtwanger considers the book as a kind of historical novel of the present. Babbitt also informed his perception of America until his eventual exile to Los Angeles in 1940. Feuchtwanger's fandom was also so great that in 1925, he began publishing prose poems about an American Babbitt for a Berlin newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt, eventually published as Pep, J.L. Wetcheek's American Songbook. He presented the poems as though they were translations of a fictional American author named J.L. Wetcheek, a wonderful pseudonym that was a literal English translation of his own name.
Yeah.
So here's the secret. Feuchtwanger.
Yeah.
Feucht means wet, and Wange means cheek in German,
Yeah.
aka J.L.
Yeah.
Wetcheek.
Yeah, great.
Eventually, the disguise was uncovered, though the poems remained popular. When he heard about Lewis's 1927 visit, he wrote in late July to inform him of the planned publication of Pep. Lewis was touched, and in a letter to Alf Harcourt, following a request that all his novels be sent to Dorothy, he writes, quote, "The Berliners have been particularly nice to me, and I have had a lot of literary editors come and call on me. Especially nice has been Leon Feuchtwanger, the author of Jesus, who wants to dedicate a new book to me." Thompson would eventually translate Pep in 1929, and it includes a wonderful dedication of Feuchtwanger with a lovely drawing by Konstantin Aladyalov, artist for the Saturday Evening Post, among others. And here is the dedication for that translation. It states, "For that good American, Sinclair Lewis, in admiration and comradeship." And I'll just give a quick moment to take a look at that. It's pretty.
Yeah, that's good.
And there's other drawings by Aladyalov in the throughout the book. Feuchtwanger further gave a talk on a Berlin radio about Lewis in 1927, which was printed in the Magdeburgische Zeitung following the 1930 Nobel. The manuscript is preserved at the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library, and you can see on this page, it is part of a series about Nobel winners called Why They Received the Nobel Prize. You can also see below, it says Wirkliches Amerika, that means Real America, a speech about Sinclair Lewis by Leon Feuchtwanger. On this occasion, I'm also happy to announce that the first translation of the speech will appear in the next edition of the newsletter, of the Society newsletter.
Great.
Feuchtwanger was not alone in his appreciation of Lewis, though, as Arnold Zweig, not related to Stefan Zweig, but a prominent Berlin novelist himself, also translated in America, published an improvisation on Sinclair Lewis on the occasion of the award and the Literatur. And the New York Times saw fit to highlight Lewis's Berlin reception in its announcement of the award. So that was part of the same announcement of Lewis's Nobel Prize. These exchanges, to be sure, were still in an era of relative political stability in wonderful Weimar Berlin. When Feuchtwanger and Lewis would finally meet personally in Berlin in January 1931, however, the Nazi Party had increased its share of the vote from 2.6% in 1928 to a shocking 18.3% in 1930. It would only get worse from there, with 37.3% in 1932. The ominous feelings of "it can happen here" were emerging, but Feuchtwanger was well placed to provide an initial warning. Influenced by Babbitt's zenith, he wrote his own historical novel of the present dealing with his Bavarian roots, a 1930 novel called Success, which dealt with early 1920s Munich leading up to the beer hall putsch. A landmark in Weimar literature, Success marked the first satirical depiction of Hitler and the Nazi Party in German literature, and it would be called a near masterpiece in Time magazine. Initially conceived in 1927, Feuchtwanger did not realize how ominous it would appear when published in 1930, not to mention dangerous for himself. The satire resulted in Feuchtwanger's immediate need for exile to France in 1933. He then swiftly wrote a new novel, The Oppermanns, dealing with a Berlin Jewish family that witnesses the Nazi takeover before fleeing. This is a much shorter, but still one of his best novels and very perceptive about politics in 1933. So if you're looking to explore more about Feuchtwanger, I recommend this novel as a great start. At this time, Lewis was experiencing his own pressures in the eventual banning of his books in Nazi Germany. Indeed, it is crucial to note that the authors in Weimar Germany who Lewis and Thompson knew would eventually all become exiles. This includes Thomas Mann, whose Nobel Prize had been given in 1929, and Lewis then in 1930. And Lewis and Thompson actually met Mann's daughter and son, Erika and Klaus, in 1927, themselves prominent artist activists in the Mann family and representing the new Weimar generation in Berlin. They had, like Feuchtwanger, moved from Munich to Berlin, with Thomas Mann remaining in Bavaria. They were also fans and writing in the following in their 1939 book, Escape to Life, about German exiles in the 1930s, quote, "During the years of the Weimar Republic, Lewis was one of the most famous non-German writers in Germany. We all knew and admired Babbitt and other books of his." Lewis was himself threatened with censorship in Nazi Germany in 1933 when Klaus Mann included his name in an anti-Nazi journal. And a year later, Dorothy Thompson herself was the first American journalist expelled from Germany. An event reported on across America, such as in the Knoxville Journal, right here. Given this background, It Can't Happen Here can be read as a kind of hybrid German exile novel translated into American culture. Weimar legacies also continued as Thompson continued to host exiles at twin farms in Vermont, and It Can't Happen Here is partly a tribute to their Vermont life. Borrowing on LA's celebrated image of the Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House as Weimar on the Pacific, Carino von Tippelskirch called Twin Farms Central Europe and Vermont. Most tellingly, Lewis mentions both Thomas Mann and Feuchtwanger in the novel. Canada becomes a North American exile answer comparable to France, England, and Switzerland, and later California. The concerns about economic survival for the common man remain a theme, though, when Vermont journalist Doremus Jessup contemplates exile. And here's the reference, quote, "It was all very well to talk about men like Thomas Mann and Leon Feuchtwanger and Romain Rolland, who in exile remained writers whose every word was in demand, about Professor Einstein or Salvini, or under corporism, about the recently exiled or self-exiled Americans. But what was an ordinary newspaper hack, especially if he was over 45, to do in a strange land?" After an initial attempt at flight and later imprisonment in a concentration camp, Jessup becomes an exiled American journalist. The novel concludes with Jessup then joining subversive American efforts with his clandestine border crossing from Canada into a certain state called Minnesota. Lewis thus emphasizes the geographic location of his two homes, Vermont and Minnesota, as border states to Canada. It Can't Happen Here then blends tropes of European exile by reinterpreting and updating the experiences of the Underground Railroad and African-American exile to the northern states and Canada. Lewis's exile network is called the New Underground. This theme further anticipates discourses about Canadian exile in the eras of the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and beyond. Such connections help to explain not only the biting and urgent political critique of It Can't Happen Here, but also the transatlantic scope of its vision. While an American warning, Lewis's novel reveals a transatlantic frame informed by the German exiles and Lewis's life with Dorothy in Vermont. It is thus not surprising that It Can't Happen Here was the only American novel to be translated into German for the exile publishing house Querido in 1936. This ensured that Lewis would be banned from Nazi Germany in perpetuity. Frederick Betz has traced the biography of that translator, Hans Meisel, another German exile, to America. It was Meisel's original translation that was used also in the reissuing of It Can't Happen Here in Germany in 2017. The enduring success of It Can't Happen Here a novel partly made possible by the extraordinary success of Babbitt in Weimar, Germany, is seen in its transatlantic resonance with both American readers and German exiles. Thomas Mann's children, Erika and Klaus, in their book, Escape to Life, the same book about 1930s exile networks, would thus list Thompson and Lewis first in their chapter entitled Friends in America. They conclude with the 1937 tribute to Lewis's novel after their 1927 Berlin meeting. And here's the conclusion. Quote, when we came back to New York 10 years later, we thanked him for his book, It Can't Happen Here. He had both impressed and startled us. For us, It Can't Happen Here is not only a supreme literary achievement, it is unquestionably one of its author's most powerful works. More than all that, it is a great political deed, or simply a great deed. He pressed our hands. He knew why we were here. He knew what we had lost, for he had lost something too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I'll take questions. I see a hand up. There's Sally's. Go ahead, Sally.
Actually, I was just clapping, but but I do have a question. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in, and this kind of dates back to the Centennial Conference in 1985, where Barry Gross wrote an article on Lewis's portrayal of Jews throughout his literature, and there are some, and It Can't Happen Here, and also there is a major Jewish character in Aerosmith, Dr. Gottlieb. And I was wondering whether you thought that Lewis's connection with the exile community and the Jewish community in Germany helped contribute to the creation of these characters.
It's hard to say. It's really interesting that, I mean, with Aerosmith being published in 1925, he hadn't really visited by then. So I think he was really interested in both German migration, but then also more generally, like we talked about, there's multiple religions and discussions of also already in 1925, the post-World War I German prejudice that gets confused and not even realizing his own background with Judaism. But it's just interesting again that is so forward-looking. One of my favorite comments about German already in Minnesota, this is in A Free Air, he talks about an encounter with Minnesota German for the first time, and he describes it as a language by German migrants who have forgotten German, and Americans who can't quite speak German. It's kind of like a combination, and so he was sensitive to those facts, and certainly corresponded with many Jewish authors, both German and European abroad. And so, but yeah, it's impressive that it's so early, and he continues with that moving forward.
Other questions for Sean? Anybody?
Well, can I just make a comment on since we're talking about translations, that it's interesting, actually distressing to note that the German translations of Lewis's novels in the 1920s, and especially of Babbitt, were excessively bad. And it's also interesting to note that apparently, I don't know whether Lewis really knew enough German to notice that, if he even read the German translation, or for that matter, later Dorothy Thompson, who did know more German than Lewis. But and here's how Lawrence Marston Price puts it in his The Reception of United States Literature in Germany, 1966, it's in the University of North Carolina Studies in Comparative Literature. Most of the German translations were excessively bad. There were unnecessary direct mistranslations of some simple English sentences and a larger number of unskillful, misleading, or meaningless renderings of American speech, thus obliterating Lewis's chief triumph, the convincing rendering of American conversation. A reviewer of Babbitt compiled a 5-page list of such inadequacies, and that's referring to Arpad Steiner's review essay, or essay review, Sinclair, Lewis in German, 1930. It was in the language monograph series, Cormier volumes at the University of Illinois. Anyway, particularly as Daisy Kurt Wolf published the German translation by Daisy Brody, a Hungarian woman who apparently had spent some years in New York. So, I mean, it's amazing how, you know, how she could have written such a miserable translation. So anyway, just since we were talking about the Spanish translations this morning, you just point out that German translations are terrible.
I'll throw this out that I mean, seems to me like when we talk about phonetic speech, it's like translating poetry. It can be so difficult to get those. When I was abroad in Germany, one of my culture shocks would be watching films with classic Hollywood actors dubbed, and you immediately this voice can't be translated. So, but it's interesting that nonetheless the book was so successful.
Yeah,
and I'll throw this out that Feuchtwanger commented that in the 20s there was much, and it wasn't, you know, some of that was critique of, you know, American economic prowess and culture, but at the same time, Feuchtwanger, his comment was, these days in the 1920s, there were more Babbitts in Germany than in the States. So he was self-critique as well. So even the bad translations, the satire certainly was received.
My colleague Jörg Tunica, with whom I co-authored a couple of, not only the you know, on It Can't Happen Here, but also on you know, I can't even think of his name now. He just died. The Plot Against America by
Philip Roth.
Yeah, Philip Roth. But Jörg Tunica tells me that because he read that German translation of Babbitt carefully. He said not only is the translation bad, but the German is bad as well. Very poor. So it was not a good choice of a translator for Babbitt, you know, by Kurt Wolf.
Did you read parts of how was Meisel's translation of It Can't Happen Here?
Yeah, well, it's better, you know. Yeah. So, but it's a difficult, you know, it's a difficult novel. I mean, I mean, that's the thing about Lewis is, you know, these novels, especially something like It Can't Happen Here, are what I call, you know, there's a density of content. That's, you know, I mean, even in lesser novels, I like work of art or so, it's so dense in content and material that makes it, I think, even more difficult to translate.
Or just the density of historical reference.
Yeah.
All the names listed in that one paragraph, people re-encountering this.
Well, you know, you would have
that just, you know, there's a famous composer named Feuchtwanger, and I was confusing Feuchtwanger and Feuchtwanger back in the day. And, you know, there's this so the density of historical reference can be challenging, but I think it's at least I'll just throw out that I find Feuchtwanger and Lewis interesting in how much they were commenting on the 20s and 30s, and I learned so much about that era by reading it carefully through the observations.
Further questions for Sean? Anybody? Fred, did you have something else to say?
No, I thought of it, but but I just forgot. I forgot what I was.
Well,
Yeah.
there'll be time after my.
I'm getting too old,
No.
I think.
I'll throw this out briefly that one of my research angles is I've been trying to figure out, because they did meet in 1931 and certainly appreciated each other's work. I know that Lewis knew about Success, the book, as well, so I think that was an influence in part. But the trail kind of goes cold after that. I don't know if they really corresponded much, or they think their trails kind of got lost by 33, 34. Even with that, Lewis kind of went his own way, though he did meet many exiles in Hollywood in their early 40s. There's multiple meetings with famous author Franz Werfel, actually, that surprised me. So there's kind of links there where he's certainly traveling to LA, but I don't find any further links with Feuchtwanger.
I know what I wanted to say. For today's reader, reading such a dense novel as It Can't Happen Here, you would actually need an annotated edition, to understand all the references and all the names and so forth that most people wouldn't know today. So I mean, people would have, contemporary readers would have, obviously more likely understood what the references and so forth without having to consult, dictionary, consult
Cultural reference.
information.
To get back to what you were saying about Germans emigrating to the US, wasn't it the case that many people who were on the losing side of various revolutions, 1848, but also after that, tended to emigrate at a time when the East Coast was full and less welcoming? And Lewis's parents would probably have known some of those people involved with radical politics in Germany, who had therefore become refugees in the Midwest in the early 1900s, late 1800s.
That's very interesting. It reminds me that already in Trail of the Hawk, there's a discussion about a kind of radical professor who's getting critiqued, and so by the local populace, and so he was aware of that. Or you think about this larger history of migration, or on the losing side, whether economically or politically, and what that might have done. That's just, or just the fact that Minnesota then is one of the few, or I guess the only state that the Democratic Party is named the Democratic Farm and Labor Party, has a kind of interesting history with that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and of course, what coming back to the connection with marriage with Dorothy Thompson, there's no question that, I mean, Lewis, who wrote It Can't Happen Here in 4 months, he couldn't have done the research, before that. He got all his information, practically all his information, from Dorothy Thompson, who had written considerably about Germany. And it wasn't just, her famous interview with Hitler, in which she kind of dismissed him as, as a really common type. And so, but what she wrote, substantial articles in the Saturday Evening Post, and articles about, Jewish persecution in the Jewish Daily Bulletin, and about terrorism and, concentration camps and so forth. He got all that from Dorothy Thompson, which allowed him to write that thing so fast. Apparently, he wrote that in white heat, he said. Yeah,
and including, I think when he originally went to Berlin, he thought he was just going to be there for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And it turned into 6 months.
Yeah.
Rich?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, an interesting point is that, of course, all these German exiles landed in California, which is exactly the same place that Aldous Huxley from 1937 onward was also sort of based. And so again, this is a connection where, again, I think it's so odd that I can't find any evidence that Lewis and Huxley met. But again, these German exiles, he was aware of this community and interacted with this community in Southern California.
Yeah.
Isherwood from post-depression Berlin also ended up in LA too, is kind of interesting, but also the kind of the trail runs code after that.
Well, Thomas Mann first went to Princeton, and that's of course Hans Meisel was his secretary there briefly. Then so that was a connection, but then he went to LA. So I mean, everybody, and Alex Ross has written about, the greatest concentration of German exiles, intellectuals, artists, musicians, and so forth in Los Angeles. So
I might leap in here just to remind people that part of Lewis's feeling for the underclass and outsiders came from where he grew up in Sauk Center, because Stearns County, Minnesota has been described as the most densely Catholic rural county in America, and all those rural Catholics were Germans. Right directly to the east of Sauk Center was Melrose, a city of a little over 2,000 people, and about 95% of the people there were German Catholic, and only about 5% Protestant. And also to the southeast of Sauk Center was Meyer Grove, a little hamlet, and everybody there was German Catholic. They all spoke German, and the church might have had 750 members, although the little village might have only had 150. So all the farmers in the surrounding region in Melrose and in Meyer Grove, which are connected, adjunct to each other, just solid German Catholic farmers who spoke German. And in Sauk Center itself, the population might have been more like 50-50, or maybe a possible majority of Germans. But Lewis, even as a kid, was able to bridge the gap between Protestants and Catholics, and between English-speaking Yankees and Germans, better than most people. He signed up for German lessons with the local priest, who was a German-speaking priest, and he was impressed by the learning of the German culture. He was impressed by these glorious new churches that were being built. They were built within his lifetime. They were brand new churches with spires that went up 100 feet in the air. He bicycled to both Meyer Grove and Melrose and climbed up in the churches. He was amazed by the material beauty of medieval German culture, and he was also impressed by the academic expertise of the Germans. St. John's College was also in the same county, and many of the faculty there had their higher education and their advanced education back in the old country. So Lewis was already sort of predisposed from an early age to not only be sympathetic with the underclasses, but also to be impressed by Germans and German culture.
Yeah, George, you wrote a wonderful article on all that, what you said in an American Literary Realism.
Yeah, it was in that journal.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, but the other thing is, when I first drove up to Sauk Center for a Lewis conference, I was amazed to see these sky-high steeples in those neighboring towns. When you're driving up at the interstate, you see them, loftily, much higher than the rest of the town. So it's just sticking up like that. It's so impressive.
And they were brand new when Lewis was a kid. They were brand new, beautiful buildings, just glorious buildings. And you don't see that in other Midwestern villages. I've lived in several, and which were mainly Protestant places. And I think that's why Lewis made Main Street into a Protestant town. You know, there's very little presence of Catholics.
Yeah.
But in most Midwestern towns, you don't see that that kind of old world architectural beauty.
Frankly and beautifully churches.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Frankly and beautifully churches.
Yeah.
George, when I first moved to Minnesota, I was impressed by the name of the local town south, New Ulm. I wonder if he visited.
Oh,
some
yeah,
of
yeah.
these spots.
I think New Ulm might have been a Lutheran place, but I can't be sure of that. There were some areas in Minnesota settled by Lutheran Germans and then others settled by Catholic Germans. Stearns County was a solid Catholic German. Garrison Keillor, you know, lived outside one of those little villages when he dreamed up Lake Wobegon. And he wrote in National Geographic sometime in the 1990s that he went back to look at the place where he had been living when he dreamed up Lake Wobegon. And he looked at the church and he thought, you know, if I had put this church in Lake Wobegon, nobody would have believed it.
My favorite Garrison Keillor joke is he talks about the Swedes wanting to escape the ice cold Lakefield, Sweden, and travel half the way around the world and end up in Minnesota and say, okay, this is good.
Yeah.
The farmland in Stearns County is very good, you know, so if those Germans came from Bavaria, which was mountainous, right, they ended up in a good spot for farming.
Well, since we're talking about all these transatlantic things, I'd like to hear from Ralph about his
Right.
paper.
Yeah.
On the way, on the way.
Yeah.
All right. I'll start by sharing with you how I started reading Lewis. It was in the early 1990s, around the same time that real estate developers vanquished environmentalists in a long battle over attractive land near my home in Southern California. For a while before that, I was curious as to why Sinclair Lewis was, or seemed to be, given less attention than the other US-born Nobel laureates. So I bought a copy of Babbitt and took it with me to a local park below the construction site of the new gated community. I knew nothing in advance about the book. I think maybe at the bookstore, it was the only Lewis offering in the place. But I had heard that Babbitt was one of Lewis's more popular books. So I started reading it, the first few pages, to the sound of bulldozers carving the hillside, that George, quote, made nothing in particular, neither butter, nor shoes, nor poetry, but he was nimble in the calling of selling houses for more than people could afford to pay. So these lines, along with the bulldozers droning, forgive the pun, but it was earth-shaking. And I've read Lewis extensively ever since. And out of similar curiosity, I researched for this conference Lewis's relationship with H.G. Wells. I have a PowerPoint. I may need Edsell's assistance getting it moving. Maybe not. Let's see. Uh-oh. I should share the screen first, I guess. There it is. Okay. You with me, everybody?
Yep.
Lecturing in London, Paris, New York, and 6 other US cities in the late 1930s, Herbert George Wells complained that the finer minds of the human race are too dispersed and unrelated to the common man. So he proposed the creation of a world brain to replace our uncoordinated ganglia, his expression, accessible to all, with universities and research institutions feeding it, informing without pressure or propaganda. It would be an interactive network, a global cerebral cortex perceiving reality and storing memory for the entire human race, making us stronger and happier, dissolving human conflict into unity. But he issued this caveat: it must not be monopolized in the wrong hands. Wells was famous for his speculations on eugenics in anticipation, invisibility, Martian colonizers, animal-human hybrids, and the descendants of the oppressed working class literally eating the rich. Wells' listeners in the 1930s may have scoffed, but today the network we're using for this conference, the one we connect with daily in the palm of our hands, is much like the world brain Wells dreamed of. The so-called ganglia are more coordinated, but the wrong hands Wells feared in the absence of safeguards against abuse are very busy. For Sinclair Lewis, H.G. Wells was a guiding spirit, we've heard today a couple of times at least. So much so that in his honor, Lewis convinced wife Gracie to name their newborn son Wells. And she says in her memoir that that's not why they named him. Well, you believe me. I wouldn't want to disbelieve Gracie. Notice H.G. Wells' influence on some of Lewis's earlier novels. Wells' Mr. Polly is an unhappy little man in his mid-30s who eventually unshackles himself and settles in the countryside. Lewis's Mr. Wren, a mid-30s bachelor afraid of losing the job he hates, eventually finds love and dreams of fleeing the big city for New Jersey's trees. Wells' Aunt Veronica rebels against her father, goes to prison for women's suffrage, and falls in love with a married man. Lewis's Ann Vickers advocates for women's suffrage and prison reform, and she falls in love with a married man. The hero of Tono Bungay, Wells' novel, is a flying enthusiast, as are the main characters of Lewis's novels Hike in the Aeroplane, written under the pseudonym Tom Graham, and Trail of the Hawk. But more than about flying, Tono Bungay is a tale of chicanery and corporate greed enabled by human credulity, elements coursing to Babbitt and through Lewis's work all the way to the end. A bogus remedy promising its users strength and beauty, Tono Bungay makes its creator a great fortune. Its sales boosted by advertising, which one character maintains is the poetry of commerce revolutionizing the world, claiming Tono Bungay as a cure for baldness, as a stimulant to keep users alert for 24 hours, boasting beneath a lifelike portrait of a barrister the legend, a 4-hour speech on Tono Bungay lozenges and as fresh as when he began, which attracted not only lawyers, but regiments of school teachers, revivalist ministers, politicians, and the like. Lewis furthered Wells' mockery of advertising in Babbitt, where Ted is nearly taken in by ads for home courses in public speaking, boxing, mind control, and other false promises by mail, and where Chumfrink proclaims that advertising is the poetry of industrialism and asks, do you know who's really the American genius, whose work ought to be preserved so future generations can judge our American thought and originality today? Why, the fellow that writes the Prince Albert tobacco ads. After reading Babbitt, Wells told Lewis in a congratulatory letter he wished he could have written the novel himself. Their correspondence continued and a friendship began. But in the 1930s, given the rise of fascism, how would Lewis, already wary of radio and print media power, have reacted to Wells' vision of a communication network with infinitely greater reach? Some evidence is found in It Can't Happen Here, which, according to Mark Shore, would never have been written had Lewis not been married to Dorothy Thompson. Richard Lingaman is more subtle, observing a single note in Lewis's manuscript that reads, "See Dee's book on Hitler." In Thompson's account of the Nazis prior to her expulsion from Germany, she asks readers to imagine that in America, an orator with the tongue of the late Mr. Bryan and histrionic powers of Amy McPherson, combined with the publicity gifts of Edward Bernays, manages to unite disaffected Americans. Imagine that, and you will have some idea what the Hitler movement in Germany means. Lewis imagines in It Can't Happen Here, mass manipulator and advertising genius Lee Saracen, the brains behind Buzz Windrip's elevation from senator to dictator. And pictured here is a scene from the Berkeley Rep adaptation, 2016. Saracen and Windrip, dedicated to destroying American democracy, equals in the art of publicity to a master like Edward Bernays. The real PR man, Bernays, earlier got Americans to support US involvement in World War I, got women to smoke more cigarettes and men to use more ivory soap, got some people to believe Calvin Coolidge was a warm and friendly guy, and later, on behalf of the United Fruit Company, helped get the democratically elected government of Guatemala overthrown. 8 years after It Can't Happen Here, Lewis wasn't done lampooning Edward Bernays and going further in a political direction than Wells did in Tono Bungay. Aware of biases in print media and the airwaves, Lewis satirized the potential of what we now call influencers to manipulate voters and consumers. His title character, Gideon Planish, is a public relations predatory marketing careerist. Formerly a college professor, Gideon goes on to become a radio commentator, ghostwriter, and account executive who could prove with graphs, statistics, and fury that the client's products are miracles that made Mr. Average American the happiest and prettiest human being that ever existed. Gideon creates a special interest group called the Dynamos of Democratic Direction, primarily funded by a wealthy businessman who wants to run for president. As George Killow pointed out at our 2017 conference, the DDD and most other groups Lewis satirizes are characterized by their, quote, devotion to talk over action, self-promotion, and tendency to increase divisiveness, combined with language that features cliches, dishonest inflation, and reliance on abstraction, unquote. All of which exhibit Lewis's prescience that, quote, formal group culture and its language would proliferate in succeeding decades. In a reverie about his work, Gideon delights in the world of committees and conferences and organizations and leagues, of implementing ideals and crystallizing public opinion and molding public opinion, of being a lord of the airwaves who could reach and influence far-flung thousands and pretty soon, far-flung millions. Edward Bernays is not mentioned in the novel. He's not named. But the phrases crystallizing public opinion and molding public opinion are the exact titles of tracts Bernays wrote about the PR profession. In 1933, Carl von Wiegen, a correspondent for the Hearst papers, told Bernays he saw in Joseph Goebbels' personal library a copy of Bernays' Crystallizing Public Opinion among materials related to the Nazis' propaganda campaigns. This shocked me, Bernays later wrote in his autobiography, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purpose or misused for antisocial ones. Bernays died in 1995, just as the internet was expanded. Also in Gideon Planish, Lewis takes a slap at Wells' early views on eugenics and race, scolding a student who believes colonized peoples will soon be shaking off foreign influence, Professor Planish insists that we of the superior race are, by some compulsion whose divine origin and sanction must remain a mystery to us, destined to rule, tenderly but firmly, all the yellow, brown, and black hordes. Mocking as it does Wells' vision of the utopia he articulated in the 1901 book Anticipation, Gideon's statement is tame compared to how Wells answers these questions he poses. How will the new republic treat the inferior races? How will it deal with the black? How will it deal with the yellow man? Those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people who do not come into the new needs of efficiency. So far as they fail to develop sane, vigorous, and distinctive personalities for the great world of the future, it is their portion to die out and disappear. According to Wells' biographer, Michael Sherborne, Wells later modified his views, arguing for the desirability of a multiracial society and ultimately becoming a leading advocate for universal human rights. Wells and Lewis didn't see each other after 1935. Their correspondence diminished, but shortly after Wells died in 1946, the New York Herald Tribune published Lewis's tribute, praising Wells for inspiring education based on imagination combined with respect for known fact and zest in disclosing undiscovered facts, not on the sanctity of academic degrees or the jealousies of competitive schoolmasters. Later in that decade, Lewis in his novels took ever bolder steps in social criticism, denouncing racism in King's Blood Royal and condemning what he called the pioneer's philosophy of prejudice in The God Seeker, whose hero, former missionary Aaron Gadd, raises with his Dakota Sioux wife Celine their two biracial children in the rapidly expanding St. Paul of the 1850s, where Aaron has co-founded a construction firm. He's a benevolent boss who encourages his employees to unionize, finds shelter for a runaway slave, and later hires him as an equal among his workers. Here, Lewis embraces secular inclusion to solve the ills he identifies. Early in the novel, standing near Lake Calhoun in 1848, Aaron notices a baby strapped to the back of a Sioux woman hoeing the ground. After which narrator Lewis interjects that almost 101 years later, that child, now a Civil War veteran and retired grocer, dwells in a 12-story apartment house near the lake. Published in 1949, the novel's cheery conclusion offers a glimpse of better relations between native and immigrant, labor and management, people of color and white. Today, the lake formerly named for the pro-slavery Senator Calhoun, who as war secretary sent troops to the Minnesota Territory, has, after a 5-year court battle, been given a Dakota name, Bide-Makaska. This paper's title borrows a line from Lewis's 1930 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said it's not only his fate to swing constantly from optimism to pessimism and back, but so is it the fate of anyone who writes or speaks of anything in America, the most contradictory, most depressing, most stirring of any land in the world. Now that those polarities are as extreme as ever, reflected and amplified by a communication network like the one H.G. Wells dreamed of, as hucksters badger us right and left in ways Lewis's Gideon Planish would have envied, we should maintain the critical awareness that Sinclair Lewis's writing inspires. A couple of postscripts. In his novel, the 2021 novel, Harsh Times, Lewis's fellow Nobelist Mario Vargas Llosa imagines how Edward Bernays persuaded United Fruit Company executives that it was in their interest to see that the democratically elected government of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz should fall. This fictionalized account contains a quote from Bernays about, quote, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of opinions, which must have been on Vargas Llosa's mind during an interview in 2020 where he said, "We must be worried that images are replacing ideas as the great protagonists of contemporary culture, reducing little by little the importance of books. And if images replace ideas, the powers of this world will very easily be able to manipulate society, even destroying institutions that preserve freedom and human rights." Such was the concern for Sinclair Lewis when he wrote Gideon Planish, his novel that turns 80 years old next year. And last night, a gentleman in the talkback mentioned something about guns. So I went to Gideon Planish to find a reference to guns. There were numerous references to son of a gun, but I found this one. It's one of the organizations that Lewis satirizes among philanthropy and other organizations that attract funds from people who are frightened. The Citizens Conference on Constitutional Crises in the Commonwealth was known in Washington as the CISCON. The CISCON's chief operative, Mr. H. Sanderson Smith, was an excellent organizational engineer, his own phrase. If the sort of beefy football squad, skull and bones, Meadowbrook Club millionaires who always intimidated Dr. Planish also despised Sanderson Smith, in revenge, he knew how to make them tremble with his inside news about Jewish, communist, and Scandinavian Irish farmer labor conspiracies against them, and radicals now known to be manufacturing submachine guns in a cellar near St. Sebastian, North Dakota. He panicked them into giving him funds with which, as he caressingly put it, he would put Bibles instead of Tommy guns into the horny hands of these sons of, well, of toil. Thank you. Well, folks, any comment, questions, raised hands? Criticism, I welcome.
Oh, gosh.
Looked like Brett had his hand up.
Who?
Brett,
I see Tad.
oh, just clapping.
Ted, go ahead.
I was also just clapping. Sorry, I'm dumbstruck.
You're just clapping. All right.
Ralph, I'll mention that the first time I heard about Edward Bernays was in this very influential documentary by Adam Curtis called The Century of the Self, which one of the things that was very concerning is just the interviews they talked about Bernays, that he constantly talked about people just sort of need to be, led, they're dumb, basically. And that was discussed in the documentary, but kind of comparing Bernays to Freud and others, it was really influential for a new generation of viewers. So that might be interesting to look at just in terms of like the reception of Bernays.
Bill Moyers interviewed Bernays before Bernays passed away. And Bernays didn't think of the word propaganda in the same negative connotation that it has today. He thought he was doing good work, and he did help out some organizations that needed the help. I first heard the name Edward Bernays at the 2017 conference. I think it was in the talkback after George's presentation, because I didn't find any mention of Bernays, George, in your paper recently. No, so it came up later.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated.
It's always okay when we do it.
I'm sorry, Roger, what?
I say it's always okay when we do it.
Oh, yeah. Sean Richards.
Yeah, this is for you, Ralph or George. Could you, the dynamics of democratic, what was that?
Direction.
direction. You listed rapid fire, like some of the traits of these, Lewis corporations that he makes. Could you just?
Well, that's what George.
Or George, I could bug you afterwards.
No, I'll just tell you, I'll requote George. These groups are characterized by their devotion to talk over action, self-promotion, and tendency to increase divisiveness, combined with language that features cliches, dishonest inflation, and reliance on abstraction, all of which exhibit Lewis's prescience that formal group culture and its language would proliferate in succeeding decades. So the way I decode that is we're living it now
Yeah.
in social media.
No kidding. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would add a
Thank
little parenthesis to this, and that is in my paper back in, was it 2017, I made the point that the target of Gideon Planish was not just evil groups, but just the whole business of groups and their language. Some of the groups that Lewis mentions are completely harmless, like the Hawkeye Association of Agronomists, or the Sociological Study Club, or the Cultural League of the Colored Races. Some of them are doing good work, and Lewis just opposes the newsletters and the policy statements and the constant barrage of this kind of bureaucratic language that's forever swamping us in modern times. Now, many of the groups are downright evil, like the Syscon group, and he calls the ones that take advantage of people philanthropers, whose fundraising efforts are downright larcenous. But some of the groups are not so evil, actually. So Lewis had a fairly broad target there in Gideon Planish.
Right. And I'll add that when Wells Lewis read Gideon Planish when he was deployed overseas, he wrote to his dad and saying, there are a lot of people in good groups doing good things. Why do you focus on that? Why do you focus more on the bad guys and the grifters than the good people? I don't know if he ever got a response, but yeah, similar. But philanthropy has taken some hits lately, is not delivering what it pretends or proposes to address. We'll leave that for another discussion, but Rich, unmute yourself, Rich.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. I really thoroughly enjoyed that, as you would expect, given my interest in Aldous Huxley. And I found your kind of discussion of the world brain and how Lewis almost certainly would have recoiled from that. I wonder if you can say anything about Lewis's general kind of reaction to Wells's utopianism. I mean, clearly Lewis appreciates kind of Wells's critique of contemporary society. But it doesn't seem to me anyway that he would be particularly enamored with kind of Wells's hope for kind of a utopian society sort of coming out of that whatever the solution is to these inequities, it has, my guess would be, Lewis would say, as Huxley said, it has to be something else than Wellesian technocracy. But I wonder if you could speak to that. I mean,
Sure. I think he gave up on utopianism as a young man. And it's an interesting passage between the essay he wrote, I believe in 1916, called The Passing of Capitalism, and the essay entitled Seeing Red in 1937, where he was disabused of believing that that communism or any kind of ism would be beneficial. So, and as I attempted to show, he was critical of Wells' earlier belief that Wells expressed in 1901 in Anticipation, that was a utopian guide that Wells wrote as a young man. And Sherburne, the Wells biographer, says it wasn't in Wells to actually apologize for anything, but he made some amends in different ways. Hi, George.
I have a question. I'm really glad to see all this material about Wells because Lewis idolized Wells, and that's been clear in everything biographical that's ever been written about him. And yet I know nothing about Wells. I've never read a Wells book, and so I wonder what you would recommend for me to start with. I generally don't like science fiction very much, and I don't like dystopian literature. So what would you recommend that I start with? Maybe Tono Bungay?
Tono Bungay is funny.
Okay, I like stuff
Yeah,
that's
you'll
funny.
get a few yucks out of that.
Okay,
And you seem to appreciate humor.
I
in
do.
Brave New World and elsewhere. So
Yeah.
yeah, Tono Bungay is widely available. There have been some studies, fairly recent studies, on how War of the Worlds and The Time Machine are both commentaries on 20th century life. That is, the colonizers from Mars fail in part because humanity is so rotten. That was one critique that I read. And The Time Machine, and Tad says in the chat box, Food of the Gods is also really funny. The Time Machine deals with class differences and the final comeuppance of the aristocracy. So those three.
Oh, thank you.
What's interesting, I went through about a dozen of Wells biographies, and almost no mention of Lewis anywhere in any of them.
Oh.
And of course, Lingaman and Shore are very thorough about Lewis's interest in and friendship with Wells and the excitement of meeting Wells, and I think it was in Lingaman that Wells expressed some displeasure with his mistress, Rebecca West, for allowing Lewis to slobber up her arm at a gathering. So you won't find very much about Lewis in Wells' biographies, but plenty in Lingaman and Shore.
Ralph, I was struck by when we're talking about the different isms and discussing influence of Wells, not only, of course, that his son with Gracie was named Wells, but that when you mentioned Ann Vickers and Anne Veronica before, I mean, that's almost the title seems even a tribute to it very directly, pretty close. Anne Vickers to Anne Veronica. So kind of his reception of Wells in terms of also gender and feminism. I was wondering what you thought the relationship between those novels was.
I found Anne Veronica to be something of a dilettante, and Anne Vickers was a very devoted social worker, spent years trying to improve the lives of women, was an early feminist, improving conditions in the settlement houses, struggling to get government to support social services and not rely on the good graces of the churches and other charities. Charity-based giving. She wanted the government to get involved. So Ann Vickers, but like Anne Veronica, is somewhat wild in their sexual proclivities. There's adultery in both books, and in Ann Vickers, an abortion. Both of those references were taken out of the early translations in Spanish. And it wasn't, and I meant to mention this with Isabel's presentation, it wasn't until 1976 that a complete translation of Ann Vickers was available in Spain. So those two. I think Ann Vickers is a much more serious character.
Cindy.
I
Cindy,
can't hear you.
Sorry, unmute.
First, just one comment about Ann Vickers. I saw the movie, the old movie Ann Vickers, and it omitted the abortion part of it in the movie, which I found interesting. But I mainly wanted to ask a question. I am not a professor or involved in any kind of university. And I just wondered, for those of you who are, which a number of you are, whether or not any kind of courses are offered in the university level about propaganda and making college students aware of this kind of propaganda that is so rampant today. And like you say, on social media and other places, and whether this is being studied and people, students are being made aware of this.
well,
I've heard, oh, go ahead, Sally.
I was going to say, I mean, in English, certainly courses that have a focus on rhetoric tend to do that. And a lot of courses in schools of communication across the country are very, very much devoted to looking at, well, propaganda, but I mean, just the way that messages are sent regardless of the platform that they're on.
I would say even at the middle school and high school level, that's my children, there are classes on media literacy that address precisely these issues.
Yeah. I'm wondering if those courses run afoul of people who don't want students to engage in any kind of discussion of controversial issues.
Well, not to get into too much detail, but there was a scandal actually involving precisely that at NYU, involving a professor teaching a propaganda course. You can look it up, although his positions were also a lot of debate. It was kind of propaganda to propaganda debate that was going on.
Any more hands up? Or there's a lot of
that I've read. In the days when I was teaching writing courses, I used to use a quote from Joan Didion that all essays are propaganda. All essays are persuasive essays, in other words. And that you can't even write a definitional essay or a historical essay without engaging in some form of selection, and therefore some kind of persuasiveness is involved. Now, how overt that is, what you agree with, what the bias is, those are things that can be discussed. And then, just because I sometimes like to do this sort of stuff, I used to have a little sheet that I would hand out about, does any matter in this course offend you? And I would list all of these things that people can be offended by. I guess it sounds a little like Sinclair Lewis, including Little Women. Some people get involved, get terribly offended by things in Little Women or The Great Gatsby, or things that seem fairly neutral to a number of people. So it's inevitable that in any course that issue can be raised. A course that just focuses on it would seem to me to be supererogatory, since it's endemic to all the others.
I might mention here that in the state of Minnesota, there's a requirement for people getting licensed to in secondary language arts. That's English teachers for teaching grades 7 to 12. And for people to get licensed, they have to learn something about the way the media work. Where I used to teach, the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, the communications department had a special course on media, and we required that of everybody who was getting licensed to teach English. So I think that's probably something that's taught in public schools around the country as well at the college level.
I'd also say that beyond, I really like that Rich used the phrase media literacy, because beyond the sort of teaching of propaganda and how it works and doesn't work, we've also tried to make an effort at Georgetown to incorporate, like, as we watch kind of institutions lose their authority, even, or maybe especially academic institutions get questioned by interested groups, and we're now all sort of clearly, Marxist armies trying to teach future Marxist armies, this kind of stuff. We want students to learn how to find the right sources to trust them. So it's not even just like the text, being able to interpret the text and whether it's propagandizing or not, but where do you go for information? None of us have, or very few of us have actually done like climate science research. So none of us can speak from our own singular authority. We have to know where to go and what the authorities are and who's telling us the truth. And teaching students to find that is actually something that isn't done very much. And we felt like we need to make some efforts in that direction too. I'm not sure if it's working, but I hope it is.
It's 4 o'clock. Maybe I should give concluding remarks. I don't know if we want to do more discussion after that. We can. I'd like to, on behalf of the Sinclair Lewis Society, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today and for whatever sessions you were at and for last night. And I'm thrilled that although, this was originally done in virtual because of COVID, that people from all over could participate because of the virtual format. And I expect that the panels and the keynote will be posted to the Lewis Society website probably by the end of the month. I'm going to send them to our website person tomorrow. The 6 essays that focused on Babbitt were presented today will be published in a special issue of Midwestern Miscellany devoted to Babbitt, and that should be out by the end of the year. The next conference on Lewis, as they say here, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, will be in 2025 in Sauk Center to celebrate Aerosmith and his winning of the Pulitzer Prize. The nature of this virtual format, I hope we'll be able to use that to some extent, even if we're in person. And I thank you to all of our speakers today for the conference: Jim Gamboni, Jim Umhafer, Isabel Marin Gomez, Robert McLaughlin, George Killow, Sean Richards, Richard Bellin, Greg Davis, Ralph Goldstein, Sean Nye, Barbara Goldstein for reading Isabel's paper, and to Edsel Sintra Gonzalez for his technical support and making sure that we
Yay.
track, and also for the translation for Isabel's presentation. So I wish best wishes to everybody, and I hope you'll celebrate the end of the conference by reading something by Sinclair Lewis. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Sally.
you, Sally.
Thank you. Yes.
Bye, everybody.
I have a comment that I want to make to correct something that I said incorrectly once before. Early in the morning, I alleged that Lewis might have been a believer, whereas Sally had said, well, he was probably an agnostic. I looked up the Lingwin biography and found the passage where he's in Kansas City preparing to write Elmer Gantry. He's preaching in pulpits and getting to know a lot of preachers. And there's that moment where right after Luther Burbank died, that somebody wrote a letter to the editor saying that such a famed horticulturist deserved to die because he believed in evolution, and so the Lord probably struck him dead. Well, Lewis in the pulpit says, well, if God strikes agnostics dead as a warning to the world, let him take a man in the full strength of his physical powers, and not an old man with high blood pressure. If God is striking agnostics down, let him strike me down. So apparently he saw himself as an agnostic, not a believer.
Good.
And you know, when Upton Sinclair ran for governor of California, people who often mistaked Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis, and do to this day, they claimed that Upton Sinclair had challenged God, and that's why he should lose the election. And he did, but for other reasons as well.
Yeah. Well, H.L. Mencken was also an agnostic. I mean, self-professed. He called himself an amiable agnostic or an amiable skeptic. He was not an atheist.
I was just going to mention, as someone relatively then also new to the society, it's just been so interesting to hear everyone's papers and get to know everyone a bit more, and it's just great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I think you can probably cut off the recording aspect of this.
Sure. It's asking me permission from you, Sally, for this link to stop the video.
Okay, what do I have to do?
So at the bottom where it says recording,
Yeah,
you can just hit close recording.
okay. No, this one says, please ask the host to give you permission to record, so that can't be it.
Oh, that's
Uh,
weird.
I don't know. I don't have any, let's see, let me try something else. All it says is it's recording now, and
So it says that Richard is the host.
Richard is the host?
Yeah, I'm looking at participants and that's what it says right now.
Oh, well,